to all of our viewers around the world. I am Dr. Camran Nezhat, the founder of Endo March and Endometriosis Day. I would like to thank you for your interest and for your interest in patients with endometriosis and their families. Since its inception, EndoMarch, almost 10 years ago, its mission has been to raise awareness about endometriosis, find a non-invasive diagnostic test, find a method to prevent it, hopefully, and better methods to treat it. By yard is hard, by inch is a cinch. We are very pleased to say that the worldwide EndoMarch has made significant progress, at least internationally, by raising some awareness. We have raised the mountain an inch. We see more and more programs from everywhere internationally that they are talking about endometriosis and interest in academic centers about endometriosis. We thank you for your interest in doing that. It's all because of your doing. And for that purpose, Worldwide EndoMarch has had series since the COVID that has been very successful for educating the interested parties about this disease, endometriosis. These are webinars that have been watched by hundreds of thousands of people around the world, and every session more than 10 to 20,000, sometimes 30,000 people on a monthly basis watch these seminars, and that is thanks to you for your interest. Because you like it, we have more scientists are being supported, and we thank you again for the support of the scientists, their work to finally find and unlock the dilemma of endometriosis. Please go to the Worldwide EndoMarch webinars if you are interested for the previous sessions and of interest for you and your families to watch it. All you need to go to the worldwideendomarch.org or endomarch.org and go to the webinar button at the top, and then if you touch it, it will get you to the session that you need to go. Also, for those of you internationally who do not have access to a surgeon or an endometriosis specialist, and you think you may have endometriosis, there is a free app. It is called Nezhat Endometriosis Advisor. That is an app that is completely free, could help you and guide you that you may have endometriosis, and you go from there to get help from a physician. To continue, today we are very lucky. We have 4 of the scientists, the most known and respected scientists around the world, that they have done significant research about endometriosis from Oxford, from Harvard, Yale, and UCSF that are joining us and are going to express and tell you how they got interested and they speak about endometriosis. We are very, very lucky to have today Doctors Zondervan, Dr. Taylor, Dr. Mismer, and Dr. Judis that have honored the EndoMarch, and they are going to speak about their work. please, if you have anything, any question, you can address it to us or to them directly. So I will proceed first with Dr. Zondervan. She is professor of reproductive and genomic epidemiology at Oxford University and head of the Nuffield Department of Women's and Reproductive Health. She is co-director of Oxford Endometriosis Clinic. And Dr. Zondervan is one of the most highly cited authors in reproductive sciences. And in 2013, she was recognized as an outstanding female scientist. She's in Oxford, England. We thank her very much for staying up late. And we welcome her. And please go ahead. Go ahead, please, Krina.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nezhat, for that really kind introduction. And I'm absolutely delighted to be able to speak with you all today. So I thought I'd first start by telling you all a little bit about me and how I came to research endometriosis, which is a journey that started more than 25 years ago now. I am an epidemiologist originally from the Netherlands, where I trained first in biomedical sciences and then in epidemiology. And I came to Oxford as a student back in the early 1990s. And during my studies, I had developed an interest in women's health and epidemiology, which I felt was an area that was very understudied. So that really led me to want to work in that area. As you know, some of you may know, epidemiology is a field of research that studies the prevalence or the frequency of health conditions and also risk factors for those conditions using very large-scale data-driven studies. And the aims of such epidemiological studies are to shed light on the burden of diseases from a public health perspective and to find factors that are linked to their causation. And a famous example of a link that was made in using epidemiological studies is one that we all know about, which is a link between smoking and lung cancer, for example. So, you know, having always loved mathematics and data analysis, the field of epidemiology always appealed to me, but I really wanted to apply those techniques to women's health. So when I first came to Oxford from the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, I started a PhD in public health and obstetrics and gynecology, working at the time with doctors Stephen Kennedy and David Barlow. And my PhD involved the mapping of prevalence and risk factors for chronic pelvic pain in women in the UK, because there were no robust data at all about how common pelvic pain was in women in the UK in particular, and there are actually very few data worldwide on this topic. And these studies show that chronic pelvic pain was extremely common, affecting 15 to 20% of women, but also that many of these women had these pain symptoms for many, many years before receiving a diagnosis, as I'm sure you are well aware of from your own personal experiences. So, and because of my own biomedical background, I was intrigued that a common diagnosis was endometriosis, which was a common that actually very few people around me that I spoke to had heard of, and that we knew very little about in terms of its causes. So I decided that after my PhD, for my postdoctoral research, I really wanted to study endometriosis to help shed light on the impact that this condition had globally on women and to better understand risk factors and causes for the disease. So first of all, together with the World Endometriosis Research Foundation, I led a study investigating the impact of endometriosis globally, in which one of my first PhD students, Kelechi Noaham, at the time analysed data from women first undergoing surgery for endometriosis in 10 countries across 5 continents, really. It's a very large study. And these data showed a remarkable consistency in the experience of women impacted by endometriosis. I mean, on average, there was a delay of diagnosis between first onset of symptoms and diagnosis of about 7 years. And that delay mainly related to the time it took for women to be referred from a general primary care physician on to a gynecologist and a specialist in endometriosis. And it also showed that endometriosis had a huge impact on the lives of women and their families, both in terms of daily lives, but also the effect on work, with an average of 11 hours a week lost due to endometriosis that we sort of calculated from these studies. And this was really a study that was very close to my heart, because it raised a lot of interest, and I got a lot of questions about, what is endometriosis and how can we research this further. And it was a study that ended up being highly cited and was amongst a sort of 25 historic papers published in Fertility and Sterility at the 75th anniversary of the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. But I mean, as I mentioned, that is work on impact and on prevalence, and it's hugely important. But I also really wanted to work on understanding causes and risk factors for endometriosis. And one of the aspects that intrigued me with my background in biomedical sciences was that endometriosis has a very strong heritable component. In other words, endometriosis can run in families. It doesn't always do, but it can do. And my PhD supervisor at the time, Dr. Stephen Kennedy, had started collecting DNA and data from women with a family history of endometriosis in the 1990s, and had led analyses investigating these families. And what I wanted to do is follow on from that work by starting large-scale studies into endometriosis, not just focusing on families with a strong family history, but also looking at genetics of endometriosis in the wider population of women. And I really hoped by understanding which genes and which DNA variants in these genes are involved in the development of endometriosis, that would tell us more about the biological causes, but also about potential subtypes of disease. This knowledge would then hopefully lead to new ways of diagnosis and new medical treatments potentially. So with that sort of vision in mind, I ended up getting some fellowships from Medical Research Council here in the UK and a Wellcome Trust, and started my own group focused on endometriosis research back in 2007. And together with Dr. Christian Becker, a gynecologist in Oxford, I co-founded the Oxford Endometriosis Care Centre in 2012. And we've worked together ever since, and building the research arm of the centre to around 25 staff and students now. So studying genetics of any disease means you have to, and genetic epidemiology, you have to study large amounts of data. And that was very apparent from other such studies that were successfully carried out for other diseases with a large public health impact. And you can think of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and we learned a lot from that. And one key aspect that we realized quite quickly was that this required collaboration between groups. And it's been a huge privilege to work with wonderful clinicians and scientists across the globe to understand the genetics of endometriosis better. And that includes the other panelists here on the call, which I'm very excited to join together with. So, but even more importantly, it relied so heavily on the willingness of women with endometriosis to participate in the research studies, and I cannot tell you how grateful and impressed I am with the dedication, and the rest of my team, with the dedication we've witnessed, and the enthusiasm with which women have participated in the studies, and those of our collaborators. And it's been a true source of inspiration for me personally as well. I just wanted to really highlight that. So you will probably ask, where have we come to in understanding these genes or gene variants that are associated with endometriosis? Well, we've just submitted for publication the results of the largest collaborative genetic study to date, involving DNA analysis from more than 60,000 women with endometriosis and more than 700,000 of women without endometriosis as a comparison. And these data were derived from 25 data sets and centres across the globe, contributed within a research consortium, the International Endometriosis Genome Consortium. So we found 42 genetic risk variants for endometriosis, 31 of which we had not known about before. And we also showed that ASRM stage 3-4 disease appeared to be really quite different in terms of its genetics than stage 1-2 disease. And work that Dr. Mismer and her group did subsequently showed that the effect of these risk variants seemed to be different between ovarian endometrioma and superficial lesions. In other words, these seem to be regulated differently genetically. And this has started further work on subtyping endometriosis that I know Dr. Mismer will touch upon later as well. Now, knowing which DNA variants increase the risk of endometriosis does not necessarily tell us which genes are affected by these variants. And this is quite a complex area. We need to ask the question, which genes are affected in their expression by these variants in the tissues that are relevant to endometriosis. And the tissue that is clearly most relevant to the endometriosis is the endometrium. So as part of our recent consortium study with collaborators, Dr. Montgomery and his team in Brisbane, we studied the effect of these DNA variants on gene expression in endometrium and also in blood, using different data sets that our groups had available. And that led for the first time to a strong list of genes that we know are affected by these variants. And many of these genes are involved in hormonal regulation, but also inflammatory response and cell growth. And our follow-on studies that we are doing now, we can now use these gene lists to identify potential new targets for medication development that could be designed. And of course, in particular, we are interested in genes that impact non-hormonal biological pathways, in particular inflammation. And just as a very brief example of that, we've just published a paper in Science Translational Medicine that really showed the power of genetics in this. In this time, we used data from family-based studies, and we identified a gene called MPSO1 associated with endometriosis. Now, MPSO1 was a really interesting gene because it also had been associated with other inflammatory conditions, asthma, inflammatory bowel disease, rheumatoid arthritis. And we then worked with other academic groups and industry collaborators to block MPSO1 in both cell assays and in other models. And look at the effect. And what we saw was a reduced amount of inflammation and a reduced amount of pain. So although we need to do a lot more follow-on work on this to understand the mechanisms involved, we were really quite excited by the potential of this particular target to be a non-hormonal target we can work with as we move on. Now, then as a final point I would like to make, I'd like to come back to my earlier point of the need of large-scale data. And of course, as an epidemiologist, I would say this, but it's, you know, it's so crucial to our work. And we've been collaborating with Dr. Mismer for many years on sharing data. And quite early on, we became aware that in order for us to collaborate effectively, we needed to collect the same data and collect all our samples using the same protocols. Otherwise, you know, if we can't replicate each other's findings, we don't know whether that is because then they're false or whether we're just not comparing the same data. So Dr. Mismer, together with Christian Becker and I, founded the WRF Endometriosis Phenome Biobanking Harmonization Project, or EFECT for short. You can look this up online if you like, but that really is the culmination of 30 centres that participating to come up to a consensus for data and sample protocol, protocols for sample collection. And now there's, these were freely published online, and anyone can use this, any research centre worldwide can use this. And there's now 50 such research centres using these tools worldwide, and they have already led to new funding to fund research into endometriosis, also in studies sort of led by Dr. Judis and Dr. Mismer here on the call. So I think that's where I should stop now. I hope that's given you a very brief flavour of some of the work that I'm passionate about, and you know, I will spend, you know, the rest of my working career certainly working on. And to say also many thanks to our collaborators in working with us on this, and thank you to you for your interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Krina. It was a wonderful presentation, and congratulations for your outstanding work and what you are doing to help the patient with endometriosis. Please stay online because our fellows and others have questions for you. And already I have been informed there is a lot of interest, so we might even go a little bit longer, and that is okay. So I will proceed. Next, we come from England to the East Coast of the United States, to Yale University, to Dr. Hugh Taylor. Hugh has been an outstanding researcher and interested in endometriosis. He is the chair of the department of the OBGYN and professor of the Anita O'Keefe Young Professor of Women's Health. And he is the past president of American Society of Reproductive Medicine. He has been devoted to research and treatment of endometriosis and trying to find out what is going on, how can we help the patient, and it's a pleasure and honor to have him. Hugh, please proceed.
Thank you so much. And I first want to just start out by thanking Dr. Nezhat for organizing this, for founding Endo March, for bringing all the awareness that is so needed to this disease. Awareness, access are so important for patients with endometriosis. So thank you for helping raise awareness, and this Endo March has been a tremendous asset to the field. So thank you for that, and among all your other contributions to the field, but particularly today, thank you for Endo March. So I started out as a physician and scientist interested in doing research to help improve healthcare. And I started out actually working on uterine biology, and I was interested in the endometrium and how embryos implant and pregnancy. But it was the patients that brought me to endometriosis. Working with patients in gynecology and reproductive endocrinology, I found that patients with the endometriosis were the probably least understood. This is perhaps the least understood disease that we treat. And the stories of patients not getting the correct diagnosis, being dismissed, could sometimes bring me to tears, were always frustrating, sometimes got me just plain angry. I couldn't see myself working on anything other than endometriosis. And since that time, I devoted my career to this. And again, it was all driven by the patients I worked with and hearing their stories and wanting to make a difference and improve that. So we've spent a lot of time working in my group on understanding the cellular and molecular mechanisms using laboratory-based models and animal models to better understand this disease. So a little different approach than you heard from our last speaker, but takes many different approaches to get to the bottom of a disease and move things forward. Our results have helped us to understand what drives endometriosis, what makes it grow, and potentially even come up with some novel treatments. Over the last few years in particular, I've been most interested in all the effects of endometriosis outside the pelvis. It was more obvious that endometriosis in the pelvis can cause pelvic pain, but we all know that that's just the tip of the iceberg. Endometriosis can occur in areas outside of the pelvis, in the lungs, the brain, many other places, not commonly, but it does. We've all seen that. Women with endometriosis have all sorts of other effects due to the disease. They have a lower BMI on average, they're lower weight. There's a generalized inflammation, as we heard about before from our last speakers, identifying some of the genes that are driving that inflammation with association with autoimmune conditions. There's an immune component to this disease. There's an effect on the brain. There have been associations with anxiety, depression, pain sensitivity. And so we've used our in vitro, laboratory-based models and animal models to really get at the cause of these things. We did some studies where we create endometriosis in mice, and we can really get cause and effect. When you see an association in women that women with endometriosis are more likely to have anxiety, well, did endometriosis cause the anxiety, or did anxiety lead to more recognition of the endometriosis? And our animal models have been really able to get at cause and effect. For example, we create endometriosis in a mouse, and the mice don't gain as much weight. We know women with endometriosis have a lower BMI, they have lower weight, lower body fat. And I've seen it in many textbooks say being thin is a risk factor for getting endometriosis. No, in our model, we proved it's just the other way around. The disease itself will cause weight loss. And we show effect on the liver, We show an effect on adipose, the fat cells, and we show how these cells are changed in a way that would make one lose weight. Endometriosis has a metabolic effect. Your metabolism is different if you have endometriosis that leads towards weight loss. So again, it's not just an effect in the pelvis. The whole metabolism is different. We create endometriosis in mice and we see whole body inflammation. We see propensity to immune disease, even autoimmune disease in our animal models. So again, endometriosis causes these whole body systemic inflammation that explains some of the conditions that we see in women that are far too often dismissed or thought to be unrelated. We know women with endometriosis take years to get an accurate diagnosis, are often misdiagnosed. And I think because of all these different effects on other organ systems, it often leads us to follow these red herrings. You have some sort of inflammatory condition that distracts healthcare providers sometimes from looking at the real diagnosis of endometriosis. It's important we understand the bigger picture so that we're not misled and we understand the totality of the disease. We really understand everything that our patients are going through. Again, we know that women with endometriosis are more sensitive to painful stimuli. They're more likely to have anxiety and depression. And again, I get, one of the things that makes me angry is when I hear people say, and you've probably all heard it, oh, these are patients are just more sensitive to pain and they're anxious. It's all in their head. We've all heard endometriosis patients dismissed and insulted. And our work in the mouse model shows that when we create endometriosis, it changes the brain. We can see changes in genes in the brain. We can see changes in the electrical connections in the brain. And the mice develop anxiety, depression, and increased pain sensitization. So anxiety and depression are a direct result of endometriosis. We know the endometriosis causes this. It changes, it reprograms the brain. Again, it's not just about what we see in the pelvis. Endometriosis has these broad effects on the whole body and explains what our patients are going through. And we know the endometriosis causes that pain sensitization. It causes the anxiety and depression. So the animal models and the molecular understanding can really be very helpful at understanding what our patients are going through to help us not dismiss these other symptoms as irrelevant and to help us focus our diagnosis on endometriosis when somebody may have a broad range of symptoms. It's still all typically endometriosis. We've also looked at some of the mechanisms. We really want to get at the molecular mechanisms that drive these long range effects so we can help understand them, diagnose, and treat them. Maybe some of the long range effects might be better treated with different treatments than treat the primary lesions in the pelvis. We can remove those surgically or we can treat them medically, but some of these long range effects, how do we revert the remodeling of the brain? How do we revert the inflammation? How do we reverse those metabolic changes in the liver and the adipose cells? So we wanted to get at the mechanisms, and our group over the last 10, 15 years have shown a role for stem cells in endometriosis, that stem cells coming from bone marrow and other places, or stem cells directly from the endometriosis themselves can travel through the bloodstream and lead to endometriosis in remote areas in the body which they can't get to through retrograde menstruation. We've again worked on drivers of inflammation in endometriosis, and we think some of those may be very good targets for treatment to get rid of some of the whole body systemic inflammation and autoimmune conditions that plague women with endometriosis. And finally, we've looked at microRNAs. These are small RNA molecules that can be made by endometriosis, but enter the bloodstream and can have effects very far from where they're produced. We know that some of these microRNAs go to the liver and help cause some of those metabolic changes, go to the fat cells and help cause some of those metabolic changes, go to the brain and start to reprogram gene expression of the brain. So maybe by altering some of these microRNAs, we can reverse some of these long-range systemic effects. Also, with differences in these circulating microRNAs, we note in endometriosis, we also think that they may be a good diagnostic. We may be able to start to use those differences from circulating microRNAs that we can detect in the blood to tell if someone has endometriosis when the when the diagnosis is uncertain, or maybe lead to earlier detection, or when someone's being dismissed and you know you have endometriosis. If we could get a definitive blood test to tell when somebody had endometriosis before we go to surgery, then decide after that whether medication or surgery is the right treatment. But if we could just detect it early, we certainly could clarify that decision. There are a lot of people who, especially non-gynecologists, who aren't very familiar or aware of the disease. So raising awareness is critical. And what we're doing here today, raising awareness, is very critical. But if those people who don't know how to diagnose endometriosis, weren't familiar with it, would have an easy blood test and then could refer them to the specialist in endometriosis, I think that would do a lot to move this field forward and shorten that tremendous delay of 10 years or so between when someone has classic endometriosis symptoms and when they actually get an accurate diagnosis. So I'm very passionate about this disease. We've done a lot in the laboratory, I think, to understand it better. It's always been frustrating to know about all these whole body symptoms of endometriosis, but I think we're starting to understand how and why they happen. And I think that will help us treat the whole patient, not just the lesions in the pelvis. So thank you, Dr. Nezhat, for all you've done. Thank you for inviting me here today, and look forward to hearing from the rest of our speakers.
Thank you very much, Dr. Taylor, for your outstanding presentation. Congratulations for your outstanding work. It is fascinating, and you opened up many eyes today with what you do, and we really are grateful for and all the patients with endometriosis owe you a lot, and thank you.
Thank you.
So we go from one star to the other star, and we are among the stars today, and very lucky to have the next star, who is Dr. Stacey Missmer. Dr. Stacey Missmer was previously at Harvard, and now is a combination of Harvard and also Michigan State. And he is the Global Impact Initiative endowed professor in obstetrics and gynecology and reproductive biology at Michigan State University. She is adjunct professor in epidemiology at Harvard Chan School of Public Health and lecturer in pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. She is the co-founder and scientific chair of Boston Endometriosis Clinic. And she has done significant amount of work to help patients with endometriosis. And it is a true pleasure to have Stacey here. Please go ahead.
Thank you so very much. It's an honor to join all of you, and also to highlight the wonderful contributions that EndoMarch has made across the globe in such a short period of time. And, you know, I started out in medical school. I actually then was inspired by a professor, Dr. Judy Lasker, really highlighting the importance of mentorship and inspiration as we're finding our career paths. And Dr. Lasker is a medical sociologist. She was focused on reproductive health, particularly around pregnancy loss and the impact on women and their families, and also focusing primarily on who had a voice, who was listened to, what information we had and didn't have. And I knew that endometriosis was described, particularly at this point in the early 90s, and still hasn't adequately shifted from being a condition of well-educated white women with type A aggressive personalities. And this really inspired my thinking and growing thinking as an epidemiologist, where we're taking, as Dr. Zondervan so nicely described, the necessary data, analyzing it in the correct way, and comparing and contrasting the appropriate people. But we knew that there are these large biases in who is suffering from symptoms associated with endometriosis and who is actually receiving a diagnosis in part of our studies. We also knew that as I was building my understanding of epidemiology and appropriate scientific approaches, that thinking of who we compare is so critical. So for example, if we're studying a pain associated with endometriosis, we're answering very different questions if we're comparing those with endometriosis to those who are healthy and have no other medical conditions, versus if we're comparing those with endometriosis to those with other pain-associated conditions like migraine. So as Dr. Taylor so nicely summarized, we see similar patterns in those with pain conditions who have been struggling for diagnosis in terms of the emergence of depression and anxiety and other comorbidities. We also know that there's differences if we compare those with endometriosis to those with other gynecologic conditions like fibroids or PCOS. These are all valid comparisons, but they're answering different questions. And I personally was selfishly inspired because my own severe pelvic pain symptoms began before menarche. And I struggled to find answers and appropriate treatment through my teens and into my 20s. And similar to as Dr. Zondervan was saying, many people didn't know about endometriosis. Certainly my pediatricians weren't mentioning endometriosis. And as someone who loved science and loved mathematics, I went to the library and found information. And at 17 or 18 years old, wrote to the Endometriosis Association of America to get more answers. And that really inspired my pivot to scientific discovery, knowing that we knew so little to help those like myself and my friends who were struggling with these symptoms. So as a doctoral student, I launched what became the first longitudinal study of risk factors for and consequences of endometriosis. So we studied in a large cohort of women across the United States, 100,000 women total, and looked at risk factors and exposures specific to early life and in utero exposures, also during adolescence around maturation, physical activity, diet, and then into adulthood. And then moved that work into focusing on long-term health of endometriosis. Again, as our first two panelists so nicely talked about, we helped to establish looking at relationships of a higher risk of cardiovascular disease, earlier onset hypertension, associations with autoimmune disorders, and also risk of infertility, starting to look at what were the associations between those with endometriosis who ultimately had successful achievement of pregnancy and successful family building versus those who experienced infertility. So starting to think a lot about what data we needed and what was absent from what we were trying to explore. As Dr. Zondervan said, she and I have collaborated for a very long time. And in the early 2000s, we, along with our colleagues, Christian Becker and Dr. Mark Lawfer, were looking to establish new studies based at Oxford and based at Harvard University, and decided that we would synergize and consider how we could establish appropriate data collections. And that morphed into their ENDOC study and our adolescence to adulthood cohort study. And we utilized the tools developed through the Worth Effect Harmonized initiative to establish not only for ourselves, but now what has been globally accepted data collection for not just information about patients themselves, but also the biologic samples that we needed access to support biomarker discovery. We also are now within our cohort established in Boston, looking at longitudinal pain symptoms, prediction of long-term symptom remission and collection. Our cohort now has been followed for between 4 and 10 years for participants. So it's also very gratifying to see the enthusiasm and contribution of so many with endometriosis and those who care about them in the studies that we do. We also, following on the excellent work led by Dr. Zondervan for the International Endometriosis Genetic Consortium, we now have some new funding to look at not only those the variation in the genes associated with endometriosis overall, and how it then associates with those loci with subtypes of symptom presentation and comorbidities. But now we're funded to look and to discover new and novel genes that may be specific to subtypes. So for example, they may appear in only those with endometriomas, or they may appear in only those who have endometriosis plus emergence of autoimmune conditions or emergence of hypertension. They may appear only in those who have stage 1 on the ASRM staging condition. So we're very excited about what is to come in the discoveries for this work. Also, Dr. Zainov and I have a collaborative project that combines our tissue and data samples along with those from the Endo study started by Jermaine Buck-Lewis, and focusing at over 800 patients with endometriosis samples, looking at markers in those samples particularly around the transcriptome, and tying that to this really deeply rich information that all these patients have so generously contributed around their symptoms and their changes over time. We're also focusing on effect now. We're expanding from those patient collections and the tissue standard protocols to now adding Paul Young in Canada is leading a new tool development for the physical exam and what can be documented more accurately and in greater detail from physicians seeing patients presenting with pelvic pain and infertility. We're also led by George Kondos in developing a tool for imaging and documentation of what is seen at ultrasound and MRI. And then finally, Aaron Greaves and Kaylin Bruner-Tran are leading new development of tools for experimental models, trying to introduce greater rigor and understanding so that we can better compare and contrast findings from different laboratories across the globe. And then finally, some new work that we're focusing on is in many ways inspired by the attention and intentions of the Endo March, recognizing that so many suffer from endometriosis-associated symptoms, but never achieve adequate treatment or even a healthy engagement with healthcare providers. And so we know that many of you here today may have struggled with this along your journey, that many remain silent, not recognizing symptoms as being problematic or embarrassed and stigmatized about them. Or when they present to healthcare providers, those providers don't understand the import of those symptoms and that this may indicate endometriosis. And so we've launched a new study called the WORK study, Women's Outcomes, Research and Knowledge, focused for now enrolling across the state of Michigan, those who are not necessarily diagnosed with endometriosis, but those adolescents and young adults who are experiencing pelvic pain and may not recognize that this is an important indicator of health that needs some appropriate healthcare interaction. And we're collecting a great deal of information on their perception of their symptoms, their attempts to interact with healthcare and how they've gone, and also looking at referral patterns, misdiagnoses, and trying to give voice to those underrepresented, those who, as of now, their information, their path and their journey hasn't had a voice in endometriosis discovery. And then finally, we're most recently looking at the impact directly of COVID and the COVID pandemic on endometriosis and whether those with endometriosis had a higher risk of COVID, whether the pandemic itself has impacted their access to care, their experience with their pelvic pain symptoms, their experience with infertility. And so that's new and exciting work that we're very interested in dedicating to doing now. So I thank you, and it's just such a pleasure to be here with today's panel and having these discussions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mismer. Fascinating, and thank you for being so up to date and including the patients with COVID, because often I know in our clinic, we regularly are asked questions about the, especially again, COVID and endometriosis. So congratulations on the wonderful work that you are doing with yourself and Dr. Zondervan. And for all of our audiences, as I mentioned, we are among the stars, and Dr. Mismer and Dr. Zondervan are next year heroes of the Endo March. So let me be the first to congratulate both of them and also announce it here that, again, Dr. Mismer and Dr. Zondervan are the next year heroes of the overall Endo March.
Thank you so much. We're both so honored and humbled by
thrilled.
this award.
Thank you.
My pleasure, our pleasure. Thank you so much. So we move to the last, but not the least, the Dr. Linda Judis. Dr. Linda Judis is very well known to the audience of the Endo March internationally, but I will proceed to further introduce her one more time. She is Distinguished Professor of Obstetrics and Gynecology and Reproductive Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco. She is the past chair of the Department of OBGYN at University of California, San Francisco. She is a biochemist and reproductive endocrinologist specializing in endometriosis, adenomyosis, ovulatory disorders, and infertility. She is past president of American Society of Reproductive Medicine. She has many accolades. It has been a pleasure for me to work with Dr. Judis for the past almost 30 years on endometriosis, and her contributions are enormous to endometriosis. And she, again, one of the original co-founders of the Worldwide Endometriosis March on Endometriosis Day and Endomarch. So I welcome her, and Linda, proceed.
Thank you so much, Camran, and I want to just express my gratitude to be able to participate in today's panel. I'll give a little background how I got into doing research on endometriosis. My PhD was in biochemistry, and I worked on the hormones from the pituitary gland that stimulate the ovaries. So of course, steroid hormones were always there in front of me. But then I needed something more. The human connection wasn't quite there for me. And so I went to medical school. And then after going to medical school, it became pretty clear that there were many areas of need, and women's health became something that I became very interested in, and then specialized in reproductive endocrinology and infertility. And it was really through that experience in caring for couples with infertility and individuals with infertility that I began to see that implantation was a new frontier, that despite IVF, there were many opportunities, and still the implantation rates were not keeping pace with much of the advances in IVF. So in my laboratory, as an early stage investigator, I began really looking at human endometrium. And around this time, I was at Stanford, and Dr. Nezhat was also there in Palo Alto, and we began operating together and talking about science. And the rest is history, because we have been really collaborators for, as Dr. Nezhat said, for a very long time. So our group in the lab focuses on human endometrium. And I did want to say that, I think Dr. Zondervan pointed this out, that in working with human samples, whether it's blood or tissue, one really needs to have standardization, because it's hard to compare a tissue from one group versus another if they're not handled in exactly the same way. And also, as Dr. Mismer also mentioned, how important it is to have what we call clinical annotation, so extensive characterization, and the Whorf effect questionnaires and database is really a treasure trove, and so important for interpreting the data that are obtained in the lab for the clinical translation. So we began to first look at the so-called transcriptomics in the endometrium and the genes that were expressed across a normal menstrual cycle, so different hormonal milieu, and then became very interested in what was happening in women who had endometriosis. And then also, adenomyosis is not always just observed in isolation, and many patients have both adenomyosis as well as endometriosis. And so we expanded our studies to looking at the endometrium of women with a number of reproductive disorders. We established a tissue bank at Stanford when I was there, and then when we moved to UCSF, that has now been transferred there. Dr. Nezhat's contributions were quite significant in that. And again, this has been really so important for moving this research on human tissue, because we only work in human tissues. We do not do animal studies like Dr. Taylor does, and I know he also does human studies, but ours are exclusively in human tissues. So we were among the first of essentially the original discoverers of what's been called progesterone resistance in women who have endometriosis. So at the level of the endometrium. And we know that the endometrium is the source of endometriosis for the majority of women who have disease because of retrograde menstruation. And what we found was that not all women, but some women who have endometriosis, within the lining of the uterus, the lining is resistant to or has aberrant progesterone signaling. So why does that matter? It matters because progesterone is so key to establishing pregnancy, keeping a pregnancy, and also for what's called normal tissue homeostasis, the whole menstrual cycle and then normal bleeding in the absence of pregnancy. And as we look a little further upstream, if you will, there are the lesions, and Dr. Taylor and others have shown that progesterone resistance can also prevail in the lesions. So it's not too surprising that some progestins may not work in terms of mitigating disease and symptoms. And in addition, there may be progesterone resistance in other parts of the body. It's not totally clear right now what's happening with the immune system and does progesterone have a role. But it's important that progesterone is able to act because progesterone basically opposes estrogen, and endometriosis is an estrogen-driven disease. The other thing that we found in the lining of the uterus was that it looked like it had some inflammation in it, so-called inflammatory phenotype. And we and others have shown now over a number of years that this inflammation does play a role in promoting the resistance of progesterone and actually augmenting the actions of estrogen. So that can result in increased disease and also in increased pain. It can also affect fertility. And there are now ways of looking at inflammation in the lining of the uterus for those who have infertility by a biopsy, looking at, for instance, a protein called BCL6. The work of Bruce Lessig. So for us, this has been quite a journey. More recently, we have now embarked on characterizing and examining in great detail using some novel technology. And I think that's one of the beauties of science is to be, as technology is developed, technology drives biology, which drives technology. And so we are working now on characterizing the local immune system within the uterine endometrium, in the lesions, and also in the systemic circulation, so throughout the body. Just recently, we have been able to, we've been funded to essentially take a precision medicine approach to endometriosis. So this is essentially looking at multiple omics. I'm sure everyone's heard of genomics and proteomics and metabolomics. And we are working collaboratively with Dr. Nezhat's group and also a group at Stanford and our team at UCSF with regard to these various omics and also including exposomics, because endometriosis risk is about 50% genetic and it's about 50% environmental. And the advances that are being made in genetics, I think, are just fantastic. And our colleagues who are on this call are leaders in the field. On the exposomics and on the environmental side, we don't quite know as much. It could be environmental chemicals, and Dr. Mismer showed several years ago that women who were exposed in utero to diethylstilbestrol, which is like an estrogen, had a higher risk of developing endometriosis as adults. And there are other kinds of chemicals that might be influencing not only developing the disease, but also the symptoms of the disease. So this is an area that's really quite, I think, an area that we need to pay attention to. We don't have a lot of answers, but we certainly do want to find out what's going on, because there may be an opportunity then for prevention as we look to the future. So what we want to do is to be able to stratify the disease, discover patterns and pathways for diagnostic biomarkers and therapeutic targets, and to develop paradigms to predict treatment responses and, importantly, risk of recurrence of disease and symptoms after medical and or surgical therapies. So these are ongoing studies. We really are so appreciative of being able to conduct these studies. We're very grateful to our collaborators and also to the women who donate their tissues and their blood so that these studies can be done. So I want to thank you, Dr. Nezhat, again for organizing all this and the team on the Worldwide Endo March. And I'm happy to participate in the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. As always, your continuous work and for so much zest you are putting behind this. I congratulate you. It has been a pleasure to work with you for so many decades and helping the patient with endometriosis. And I admire your work and thank you very, very much for your continuous work to try to end the enigma of endometriosis. As I said, we have been among the stars today, and it is lucky for all the patients with endometriosis that we have people like yourself. So we have our fellows here, Dr. Shruti Agrawal, who is a second-year fellow. Fellows, for the purpose of the audience, we want to let you know they have finished all of their OBGYN training in excellent institutions in US, and now they are doing a program of the fellowship in endometriosis and minimal invasive and robotic surgery. Dr. Agrawal is the second-year fellow. Then we have Dr. Deborah Lee and Dr. Mahkam Tavallahi, that they are first-year fellows, and they have some questions for our panel. And I would start with Dr. Agrawal, Shruti, and Deborah and Mahkam. They are wonderful, the most incredible fellows, very hardworking, very interested, and it has been a pleasure for me to work with them. Shruti, please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. This has been very, very informative to know all the different researches going on. Our patients often ask us questions, so it's really nice to know that we can answer some of them. I have a question for Dr. Zondervan, actually. It's actually also a question. Good morning, Dr. Zondervan.
Hi.
It's actually one of the questions that one of the attendees has also asked, so I will ask on their behalf and mine. We often have patients that the first-time mothers who come to us for the first time ever thinking they have endometriosis, and when we tell them that, you know, the symptoms are looking like they possibly do, their follow-up question always is that I have daughters at home, I have, you know, nieces at home who have similar symptoms to what I have. I mean, we literally had 2 patients just yesterday. So do you think that these women and girls, when they come in, they can be screened for genetic variants that can predispose them to endometriosis?
I think it's a really excellent question, and as you mentioned, it's one that we often, you know, hear, and unfortunately, I would have to say at this point in time we can't use that knowledge that we have for that particular purpose, and the reason is because the genetic variants we have identified, each of those increase the risk of endometriosis only by a very small amount. So if you add up sort of the whole sort of panel of 42 variants that we now have, that only explains about 5% of disease risk. And as you can imagine, you know, sort of putting together a test on the basis of that would really not be, you know, very helpful to women, you know, for screening purposes. So I think that the value for genetics currently is for us to understand the biology of the condition and to identify subtypes of disease and to try and identify new targets for the development of medical treatments that actually target those subtypes specifically. That's the vision that we have, but unfortunately they don't have use as a clinical screening tool at present.
I see. Do you think that will ever happen, where we'll ever have it to where we can just screen people and be like, you have endo or you don't?
So I think on the basis of genetics, it's unlikely. And part of the answer is as the statistics that Dr. Giudice already mentioned, only about 50% of endometriosis risk is genetic. The other 50% is environmental, and that's to do with factors that are, that either predispose or potentially protect to develop endometriosis. So that's one. So only about 50% we know is genetic. Actually identifying all those variants that contribute to that 50% is a very, very difficult task indeed, and is almost impossible. And we know that from other disease areas. I mean, for example, if we look at a field like breast cancer currently, they're now nudging up to, understanding perhaps about a quarter of genetic risk. And they're starting to think about, can tools that combine genetic risk variants combined with known environmental exposure, risk assessment, family history, it all together, can that be developed into a tool that is useful for screening? But I think even then, the question is, well, the answer probably is it's a screening tool. It will never be a diagnostic tool. So I think we need to look at other ways of diagnosing endometriosis. For
a couple of genes in breast cancer, at least, that have a huge effect size. We don't think we're going to
Well, yeah, familial breast cancer, certainly familial breast cancer, but non-familial breast cancer, Hugh, the genetics of that it looks just the same as it does for endometriosis. So you're absolutely right.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's amazing. Do you think your project with EFFECT will one day be able to achieve this, like try to find out the environmental versus genetic factors for endometriosis? Is that the final goal of having the standardized data?
So I think what we're hoping is that, if many research centres collect data the same way and collect samples the same way, we'll start to be able to leverage the power of those studies jointly, and start teasing out these environmental factors that Dr. Giudice also mentioned, and Dr. Mismer, and because we need the sample sizes to tease some of these effects out. So yeah, that's the hope.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I appreciate you answering my questions.
Oh, you're very welcome.
So next we go to our next fellow. Thank you so much, Rudy. You were great. Thank you so much for asking those questions. She is right. We saw these patients yesterday, and that was very good of you to think of it, that we had two of those patients that they were asking this question. And Dr. Lee is our first year fellow. She's very dedicated mom, the hardest working mom and fellow that I have seen. I am very proud of her. Please, Deborah, go ahead and ask your question.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for sharing with us all of the interesting research that you've been doing for some time, and all that you're doing for patients. Like Dr. Nezhat and Dr. Agarwal have said, we see these patients every day, and even just this webinar today is going to help so many people who have a lot of questions and concerns, family members who are having these symptoms. I have some questions for Dr. Mismer. Dr. Mismer, thank you so much for taking time out and for sharing all about your research and everything you're doing for women with endometriosis and pelvic pain, for adolescents with pelvic pain. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We're still going through the pandemic, and we know that the pandemic has had effects on numerous medical conditions, whether it's delayed care of known conditions or delayed diagnosis of unknown conditions. In our clinic, we have a lot of patients who, had other conditions along with their pelvic pain or endometriosis, and so they couldn't come to see us. We hear about it all the time, and luckily now with the vaccine, people are feeling more comfortable coming in. We wanted to ask if you feel that the COVID-19 pandemic has had an impact on, chronic pelvic pain and endometriosis in any capacity that you feel.
No, thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you very
Lee, for
much,
that.
Deborah, for asking. And Dr. Mismer, exactly what Deborah is asking. And the same way, the majority of our patients, almost 95% of our patients who come to us, they are infertility patients who have endometriosis, who have not gotten pregnant, and they have had IVF, failed IVF, their husbands are okay, all of their lab works are okay, and we work with wonderful endocrinologists, REIs like Dr. Evazadi, Amy here, and Dr. Sally Tazuke, Dr. Bake in Los Angeles, and Dr. Sunny June. And these patients that they have failed, and also Dr. Judis, of course, we do, and they come here to have surgery for endometriosis because they have been diagnosed by recent receptiva tests, excuse me, for possibly have endometriosis. And their question is constantly about COVID and what it is. So that would be great. Thank you, Deborah, for asking that question.
No, absolutely. It's certainly something that's impacting everyone, but those who, there's really two different areas of focus here. One is those who were already experiencing endometriosis-associated symptoms, whether they were chronic pelvic pain or infertility. How has the pandemic impacted that? And Dr. Lee, you alluded to something really important, which is that particularly in our pain-suffering patients, many already had coping mechanisms established, already had interactions with healthcare that were working successfully. And with the pandemic, many of those were upended or went away completely. And so the reality that those coping mechanisms now were no longer accessible, or the access was diminished. And then add to that this heightened reality of stress. Many have had economic stressors, many have had familial stressors. So independent of whether women themselves have been infected, whether they have had access to vaccination, we're seeing changes and impacts that are negative and need to really be addressed. The second part is looking at whether infection itself is impacting these symptoms, whether it's impacting fertility, time to pregnancy, becomes a really important question that it is difficult to answer cross-sectionally, because again, we know that stress itself and large life upheavals do have impacts on pain and on fertility. And so we've really started going to those cohorts and those data where we have long-term information. So we have pre-pandemic information and post-pandemic information to compare and contrast. So for example, in our adolescent population, we are seeing that heightened stressors are resulting in higher, more frequent flares of pain, and less responsiveness to their current treatments. But we're also seeing that although in preliminary data, and we're just adding an extra bunch of data collection to reinforce this, but in preliminary data, we are not necessarily seeing that our patients with endometriosis have a higher risk of COVID infection. However, those who have had an infection seem to have a higher risk of longer term symptoms. And so they're more likely to be not necessarily fitting the full criteria of a long haul COVID patient, but they are on average having longer fever, longer upper respiratory impacts, and perhaps more severe symptoms. And so, these are very early days in these studies. A close colleague of ours, Lauren Wise at Boston University, she has a study that has been for almost a decade now, looking at women who are attempting pregnancy and factors influencing time to pregnancy. And she's now looking at whether COVID infection and or vaccination is influencing time to pregnancy. So far, thankfully, seeing no negative impacts of vaccination, but they're now looking at that infection information. So all very early days for data, but such important things to consider, and definitely having impacts on the patients that we all care about.
I just add something to that. I'd really like to emphasize what Stacey said, is that we don't have any evidence that vaccine is harming anyone. There's good evidence now that it's not compromising future fertility. And I just want to make it very clear to everyone that we encourage you to get the vaccine. Certainly the risk of infection is clear. As Dr. Mismer just pointed out, there may be some increased risk for long-term complications if women with endometriosis get this disease. So getting the vaccine is the right thing to do.
Absolutely.
Everyone should get their vaccine. The risks are even higher in pregnancy. And if you're infected and can't get your endometriosis care that you need, that could further compromise your condition. So I just want to make a clear plea to everyone to get vaccinated.
And absolutely, and Hugh, that's so important. And to reinforce again, we all knowledgeable in this footprint ran to get our vaccinations. We also ran to get our children who are eligible vaccinated. And so reinforcing again that that the vaccination is absolutely a critical step toward prevention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mismer and Dr. Taylor. You don't know how much you really help our patient, because we receive all the time for our infertility patient. As I mentioned, the majority of our patients are patients who want to get pregnant and they have endometriosis, and this is their question. You don't know how many of them you really helped. And I promise you, your videos are going to be immediately given to all of our patients that they ask this question. That is, I say, here are the experts. You should listen about the COVID. And so I thank Deborah for asking. So, excuse me again. Last fellow of ours has a very interesting background. She quite knowledgeable, interested, and dedicated to endometriosis. She actually, beside OBGYN, she did a fellowship and work in pathology at Stanford. And I have known her for a long time. Before, she has had rotation with us. And she's so interested that despite not feeling very well, and I asked her, please rest. She says, no, I want to participate and I want to have the opportunity to talk to this panel. Dr. Makam Tavallai is our fellow, and it's a pleasure to have her. She's quite bright. And please, Makam, go ahead and ask your questions.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the impressive presentations. And I'm very impressed by all the research from everyone. So my question is from Dr. Taylor, actually. And it is a question that one of the attendees asked as well. And I was wondering, I think you briefly talked about how we think that endometriosis is a systemic disease. And I'm thinking about when you're choosing medical treatment compared to surgical treatment for the disease, how are we choosing between the hormonal treatments, oral contraceptive pills versus the GnRH antagonist, and where are you going to choose between these two? And also, one of our attendees asked if we think that the hormonal treatments are only going to control the symptoms versus preventing endometriosis from progression, and is there any data and research on that?
Well, let me take that. I think there were several questions there. Let me start with progestins versus GnRH antagonists. I generally start with a birth control pill, an oral contraceptive, and tend to use it continuously rather than cyclically. But as Dr. Giudice pointed out, and was one of the first to identify the progestin resistance, it's the progestin, the birth control pill, that has the therapeutic effect, and a good percentage, probably up to a third of patients with endometriosis will have or develop progestin resistance and need to go on to a second-line therapy. In the old days, that was cumbersome with the GnRH agonists, the injectables, and the delayed onset of action and the profound suppression. With the GnRH antagonists now, it's a lot easier with an oral medication. Although there may be progestin resistance, endometriosis is always estrogen dependent, and reducing estrogen or eliminating estrogen can treat most endometriosis. But there's always a role for surgical therapy as well. I mean, removing the lesions is a rapid way to treat this. Removing lesions can help improve fertility. Removing scar tissue adhesions, no medication will do that. So they're disease that and not because it's resistant to estrogen deprivation, but because it's done damage and caused fibrosis, scarring, adhesions that will never be treated by any medication, that will need surgical therapy. So it takes an endometriosis expert. It's a subtle distinction as to what's treated by what means. But even after surgical therapy, I think medical therapy is a good idea to prevent recurrence and to help alleviate some of these systemic effects. My hope is that as we define these systemic effects better, that we define the mechanisms by which endometriosis causes effects on brain, on immune system, on metabolism, we might be able to specifically target those in ways that are non-hormonal, that may have fewer side effects. And that's something we're working on right now in the laboratory, that might be able to specifically target those systemic effects rather than this blanket approach with hormonal therapy. But for now, I usually would still start with an oral contraceptive. They're easy and inexpensive, and for a good number of patients, they're very effective. But always keep a close eye on my patients. I don't let anybody go for months without bringing them back to see if they're failing on an oral contraceptive. I think that's important. It's not the kind of drug you prescribe a progestin and say, come back in a year. Let's see how you do. You know that a large number of these patients will be resistant to progestin, and you need to bring them back for close follow-up and be clear that you can advance therapy to, I would recommend either a GnRH antagonist or surgical therapy if progestins fail.
Thank you very much, Hugh, and thank you very much, Michael. There are some questions from all the fellows that have told me, well, we know Dr. Judis, we are working with her. So let me see what, they had a question. I think you can, all of you ask Dr. Judis. Shruti and Deborah, you told me that you had a question. Linda, let me ask you, do you remember yesterday you told me I told you which one of you are going to ask question from Dr. Giudice, and you told me we would all know her, we want to ask her questions. So please go ahead.
Yes, sir, absolutely. Dr. Giudice, good morning. Thank you so much for being with us today and sharing more with us about your research. I had a question about endometriosis and infertility. We know that infertility is a condition with a wide variety of causes. There's many different treatments for infertility depending on what type you have. And we know that endometriosis can cause infertility or subfertility. So if a woman has infertility, are there any tests to diagnose endometriosis? And what kind of treatments are available to increase a woman's chance of pregnancy if she has endometriosis causing subfertility or infertility?
That's a great question. Thank you. So you're right. There are many causes for infertility and subfertility, and perhaps the most challenging from a diagnostic and therapeutic perspective is unexplained infertility, and also infertility or subfertility associated with endometriosis, so known endometriosis. And the usual paradigm is, as you know, ovulation, stimulation, and insemination, whether one uses letrozole or clomiphene for unexplained infertility, and also for endometriosis-related infertility. The issue, I think, becomes, if someone has unexplained, then how do we know if endometriosis may or may not be a cause of the disease? Surgery is one way to find out, as you know, a diagnostic therapeutic laparoscopy for the reasons that Dr. Taylor mentioned in terms of adhesions, plus also decreasing the burden of disease and the associated inflammation within the pelvis that can not only affect egg quality, but also with regard to embryo toxicity, and can affect the lining of the uterus, so the receptiveness, if you will. There is a commercial test, and I have no conflict of interest in this regard, called Receptiva, which has been marketed essentially to look for markers of inflammation within the endometrium. And this is looking at BCL6 which is something that should not be present in the endometrium or is very lowly expressed in women who do not have endometriosis. And most of this work comes from Bruce Lessie's group. Dr. Nezhat and his team also have published on BCL6 as well with Dr. Sally Tazuke and your team. And so, you know, when you send so should everybody get screened for it? We're not quite there, I think, with regard to everybody getting a BCL6 as part of their infertility workup from day one. The most, I guess, impactful part of getting a BCL6 test is with recurrent implantation failure or with euploid embryos, say, after IVF. Now, maybe some people don't want to go through IVF and have 3 failures and then get a test. So it's not totally unreasonable. But if there are known causes for infertility, say severe male factor or ovulatory disorder, polycystic ovary syndrome, then getting BCL6 may not be the first item on the list. If one does get a positive BCL6 expression, which is an abnormal result, then the question is, okay, what can we do about it? And the data right now, I understand, at least on clinicaltrials.gov, there is a clinical trial underway and a randomized control trial. And the goal really is to understand what's going to help with regard to getting rid of the inflammation and therefore lowering the BCL6. So the correlative data that have been published suggest that or demonstrate that treatment with GnRH agonist or with progestin for 2 months or 3 months is correlated with higher live birth rates, both in the IVF setting and in the non-IVF setting. We don't really know, though, are these the optimal medications? Does it really restore BCL6 or decrease BCL6 expression? No one's done the assay after to see if the pregnancy happened because of that, or did it just happen by chance? And so I think the next frontier is assessment of inflammation within the endometrium, if that is essentially sort of the last frontier of the infertility evaluation and treatment. And we really need randomized controlled trials to understand what and if certain therapies will restore fertility and for what durations of time.
Thank you very much, Linda. That is wonderful. I appreciate it. And thank you very much, Deborah, for asking. And Dr. Agrawal, that she also wants to ask you some questions about infertility and BCL6. And also she did a research, as you say, she published it. Perhaps she can talk about it and ask you. Go ahead, Judy.
Good morning, Dr. Giudice. It's been a pleasure working with you lately. So thank you for that. You were talking about BCL6, being a marker for inflammation. And as the patients themselves learn that part too, they start asking questions about, their body being inflamed. And if their whole body is inflamed, how should, they take care of that? Because there are several things on the market for inflammation of the, a lot of people start using turmeric nowadays. So they start asking us questions about what should they do for this systemic inflammation, how they should decrease it, if there's supplements for it. So what are your thoughts on these patients saying that?
Thank you for the question. My patients also ask me the same thing. And what I tell them is, because many come in with being on antioxidants and a variety of other anti-inflammatories, there are ways to, at least from a nutritional perspective, the endometriosis diet has been suggested. The hardcore data, and I've looked to Dr. Mismer and Dr. Taylor to comment on that, because I think, there's not everything has been shown to work. However, it may work. And at least as we sort of rationalize the mechanisms, we tend to support going after some of these anti-inflammatories. The other thing is with regard to whole body inflammation, I think it's important that we distinguish a highly inflammatory state from one that is subclinical or a low inflammatory state. And women who have endometriosis, for the most part, have a relatively low inflammatory state. I think being concerned that your whole body is on fire because of inflammation would be misleading. I see Dr. Taylor is shaking his head, and please feel free to comment, Hugh.
No, I couldn't agree more that it is a low-level inflammation. I mean, I think going too far with trying to combat inflammation can also have negative effects on implantation in somebody who's trying to get pregnant. If there's an inflammatory-like reaction that goes on in the endometrium that's required for embryo attachment. So we don't want to go too far. Some anecdotal or some interesting evidence on some anti-inflammatories like fish oil and resveratrol seem to be promising, but I wouldn't go all out with strong anti-inflammatories that could have other negative consequences.
Correct.
I'd like to thank you, but there are a lot of questions coming in. So we thank you for staying online, and with your permission, we will continue to address at least some of the questions because a lot of more and more questions coming in this regard. So I would ask you some of them myself that we believe, and as you said it, the question is often they are asking why do patients after surgery they get pregnant, because we recently published a paper that Shruti Agrawal was part of it mainly, and Shruti, I'd like you to present it in a very short part that when we saw the pregnancy rates ourselves, we couldn't believe this. Years ago, we published a paper with Dr. Judis that essentially when she was at Stanford, they would send the patients to us who wouldn't get pregnant in their division. We did the surgery, and Eva Littman was the fellow. And at that time, it was a small number of patients, but the pregnancies were amazing. We couldn't believe it. This passed down until recently. We have had a large group of patients that they have no reason infertility. The husband is okay, the wife is okay, they have no pain at all. They only don't get pregnant. There are patients of Dr. Amy Avazadeh and Dr. Kelly Bake in LA, and Dr. Sadi Tazuka and Sunny June at CCRM, and Dr. Nezhat Talebian in New York, who works with Dr. Farr Nezhat. When we did surgery in these patients and when we treated them, we could not believe the pregnancy rate ourselves. I questioned my fellows when they told me we have that higher pregnancy rate. I told them, are you sure? They went, they evaluated the data with the physician that I mentioned several times, and they said, well, this is the pregnancy rate. So if it is true, obviously we need surgeons who are very trained and treat endometriosis properly. As I said, I was questioning myself when they told me this patient, more than 90% of them, and even higher, getting pregnant either spontaneously or with continuous IVF. And I want Shruti to comment. And so there is a reason that it works when we treat the disease. The limiting factor is the skill and experience of the surgeon and the availability of proper instrumentation. It should be properly surgery done, number one, to cause no harm, not to cause problem for the ovaries, and also treat the endometriosis properly. And endometriosis is far, far more common than we think. And that is upon us to find a good method to diagnose it. And endometriosis globally, if we diagnose it and treat it better, probably would unlock, in my opinion, the treatment for ovarian cancer. For some reason, when we treat this patient surgically, properly, we have seen the quality of embryos better. We don't have randomized studies. It's very difficult right now to prove it. Sometimes Dr. June, Sunny June, at CCRM tells me, look, I see the eggs are getting better. For these, some reasons, these people get pregnant. Dr. Judis has, in her paper with Dr. Cow years ago, showed all the reasons that they cause infertility. But these people, when it is done properly, they get pregnant, and we need more help people to get trained and treat these patients. Shruti, if you want to say something, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Nezhat. Yeah, we looked at these patients. They were aged around 29 to 47, and they were all trying to conceive beforehand. There were 74% of them were nulliparous. They'd been trying to conceive for about 2 years on average, and then they were all tested positive for BCL6. They all underwent surgery with us, and then we looked at the clinical pregnancy rate. After we, some of them we lost to follow up. At the end of it, from the 75 patients, we had about 40 at the end of the study to look at. And when we published the paper, it was about 90% of them were able to get pregnant. And we kept following them. Right now, I know the paper should be updated. It's about at 100%. All 40 of them ended up getting pregnant. I went back and looked at these 40 patients to see how long they had been, trying to conceive before surgery, and then after surgery, how long it took them. That's the paper I recently presented at ASRM as a poster presentation. And it was 29 months to conceive before surgery and an average of about 4 months after surgery to conceive. And all of them had pathology proven endometriosis. So it also further solidified that the predictive value, the positive predictive value of BCL6 is pretty high.
I mean, we've known since the days of the Endocan study that, with prospective randomized trial that showed surgery improves pregnancy rates. So I think this, and that was, stage 1 and 2 disease. That was not with the same level of surgical expertise. That was a group of different people performing those surgeries. So it's not surprising in more advanced disease and in the hands of a surgeon who can recognize the more subtle variants of endometriosis that really can completely excise it, that doesn't do harm to the ovary, that we might see some very good pregnancy rates with surgical therapy. It doesn't surprise me at all. It would be great if we could do a prospective randomized trial like the Endocan, but I think these days that would never be acceptable. Who's ever going to allow a surgery without removing the endometriosis? We'll never be able to do that. But this data is exactly what I would predict.
Thank you very much.
Kind of prospective study I think that might be doable is for those who are BCL6 positive, to be randomized, say, to medical therapy for 2 to 3 months, and then a rebiopsy. So not necessarily a pregnancy outcome, because I think you're right. When patients have an abnormal test and they're trying to get pregnant, it's very hard. And I think we all understand that. It would be difficult to recruit. But at least for proof of principle, I think there could be a randomized controlled trial looking at BCL6 positive patients and what happens on therapy to BCL6 expression. And then also probably another control group of BCL6 negative patients and see what happens in terms of response to medication.
Thank you very much. And I'm glad you brought it up, Linda, that the issue is you have to remember the data that Dr. Agrawal presented. A lot of these patients, not only they had failed IVF, they also failed medical treatment. Finally, the physician decided, okay, let's do surgery. So they have already received medical treatment, 2 to 3 months of GnRH agonist or antagonist priorly to also. There are questions for the panel, and this a lot of questions, and any of the panel would appreciate it if you address it. One of them asked Dr. Mismer that, do you think food preferences during the lockdown played a role in COVID in your patients, or should women with endometriosis be treated as high-risk pregnancies?
So, the food question is a very good one. We certainly know that dietary patterns did shift particularly during lockdowns. I will say that in our adolescent population, where we're looking at before pandemic to intra-pandemic changes, their diets, they were mostly eating French fries and mac and cheese to begin with anyway. So, you know, we're not seeing informative dietary shifts, but it's definitely something that should be evaluated and certainly can have a relationship with symptom expression. In terms of pregnancies, that there's not evidence sufficient that anyone with endometriosis needs to be categorized as a high-risk pregnancy. I certainly defer to Dr. Taylor to weigh in here. There is some evidence of increased early pregnancy loss, but that's very different from categorizing patients as, you know, high risk to be monitored throughout their pregnancy. Hugh, do you want to lean into that one a bit as well?
There is some association with some adverse pregnancy outcomes, but these are rare. I would not call an endometriosis pregnancy a high-risk pregnancy per se. A slightly higher risk of some pregnancy complications such as preeclampsia, but it's still unusual and I would not consider someone with endometriosis becomes pregnant at high risk.
Absolutely.
Agreed.
There is thank you so much. I know that you were recently on the WHO panel at the ASRM, and all of you, thank you for being there, and there was a lot of interest. Would you please share, and what do you think is the plan of WHO, World Health Organization, for increasing awareness about endometriosis? What do they want to do? Can you share?
It was wonderful to see WHO put on a panel at the ASR meeting. We're very, very pleased that it's getting that sort of international recognition to increase awareness, to increase access. I think that's where it starts. This is a worldwide problem. It's not just here in the United States that awareness is inadequate everywhere around the world, and access is even worse in many places than in the United States. It's not good enough here by any stretch of the imagination, but you can only imagine what it's like in other places. So the attention brought to this by WHO, I am so thrilled that they are recognizing it and helping to increase awareness. Wonderful that they presented at ASRM.
Yeah,
But
that
I'd
they
like to
released
add-
the fact sheets. I'm sorry, Linda, that they released a fact sheet specific to endometriosis. It is hugely impactful and really not only raises awareness across the globe at various ministries of health, but starts to build the foundation for requirements around inclusion of endometriosis and pelvic pain in the dialogue about focus and responsibilities for healthcare across the globe. Linda, I cut you off.
No, I was going to say exactly the same thing, that on the World Health Organization website, you can access the fact sheet. It's an amazing acknowledgement on the part of WHO, and an important one. So their interest in it, I think, is quite firm, and I'm sure we'll be seeing more in the future.
So we thank all of you, and it is, as you mentioned, it is great to see that finally World Health Organization and other organizations are coming to the rescue and help of patients with endometriosis. As I said, by yard is hard, by inch is a cinch. And we are very pleased to see that some of everybody has, a lot of people are doing this. And we are very happy to see some of the efforts of Endomarch also getting globally and getting other people interested in women. If endometriosis was a man's disease, I really believe there had been significant progress. And I am a man, I am saying that. We see patients every day in our offices with our fellow that you don't believe it. They cry when we believe them. They say it is not in your head. They cry when they come, and finally they say, at least I know why I'm not getting pregnant. And you know, so it is something that needs attention to really believe our patients. It's not all the physicians mean well, they have good intentions. it is an issue that it is not on the radar of medical professionals, other people. We should let it know more. Autism is significantly a small number of people have autism than endometriosis, but endometriosis is not well known. It should be publicized more, and hopefully we do more. This has been a fascinating program. We thank very, very much Dr. Zondervan, Dr. Taylor, Dr. Mismer, Dr. Judis, Dr. Agrawal, Dr. Lee Tavallahi, and our organizer, Zoe Pennington. You have been great, and we really appreciate. Hopefully we can get you back in again in another session, because there is a lot of interest still, but I don't want to keep you. I know Dr. Zondervan has to go to sleep probably. But in the next 2 months, we are going to be in holidays. The other worldwide Endomarch webinars are on the website, Worldwide Endomarch. Go to the website and look at the webinars. You can look at them. And if you do think anywhere in the world you have endometriosis, the Nezhat Endometriosis Advisor of Endomarch is free. You can use it. At least it could help you. It is highly, highly accurate. It has been taking many years for us to do it. Our fellows have confirmed it over and over. It is more than 92 to 3% accurate in diagnosing endometriosis on infertility patients and also on pain patients, in both of them. So we thank you. All of you, you have asked occasionally. Some patient was last week asked me, I wanted to donate. If you want to donate to any of these scientists, please look at their website. If you want to donate to Worldwide Endomarch, please go to the Worldwide Endomarch website. By yard is hard, by each is a cinch. Forward we go. We are going to make this successful, and we will help the patient with endometriosis and their families around the world. We thank you. We wish you a greatest holidays, and we will be back beginning January with new sessions of Endo Explain. And we congratulate all the panel, especially next year, Endo heroes, Dr. Mismer and Dr. Zondervan. Thank you very much again, and forward we go. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.